This is my true story. I spent my whole life building a home, raising a son, and believing that love would protect me when age finally caught up. But I was wrong. My son's wife never saw me as family, only as an obstacle standing between her and what she wanted. She called me useless, mocked my wrinkles, and once looked at me and said, "You're pathetic." I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I simply smiled, because I already knew something she didn't. When the truth finally came out, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Before I tell you what happened, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. It happened on a Sunday morning. She was standing in my bedroom using my mirror, the one that had belonged to my mother before me. She leaned close to fix her hair and said it like she was talking to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. "You're pathetic." The words rolled off her tongue like perfume turned to poison. My son laughed from the hallway, soft, careless, the kind of laugh that cuts deeper than a shout. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, holding my cup of tea, feeling the weight of silence press against my chest. I had survived too much in my life to let one sentence destroy me, but it didn't mean it didn't hurt. It sank deep, slow, steady, and cold. They both left for brunch after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking into the mirror she'd just used. My reflection looked tired, yes, but not weak. My wrinkles were not signs of pity. They were proof of survival. I had seen war. I had buried a husband. I had raised a son with hands that worked until the skin split. I had built the house they were now living in. Yet, in that one careless moment, she decided to rewrite my story into something small. Pathetic. I took a long breath and promised myself I would never let that word define me. For the rest of the day, I moved slowly through the house. The sunlight fell across the floorboards I had polished with my own hands decades ago. Every mark, every corner, every small crack in the wall carried a memory. To her, it was just an old place that needed modernizing. To me, it was the history of everything I had ever loved. I made dinner that night, quietly, without speaking. My son didn't notice I hadn't eaten. His wife complimented her own cooking and talked about business expansions. I watched them talk, both of them young and full of pride, neither realizing how much of their lives had been built on the sacrifices of the woman they mocked. That night, I sat on the porch. The air was cool. The sky was wide and heavy with stars. I thought about the things people say when they think they're winning. I thought about how pride makes the mouth run faster than the mind, and I thought about how revenge, true revenge, doesn't come from anger. It comes from patience. I had always believed silence was my weakness. That day, I learned it was my weapon. I replayed her tone over and over again. Pathetic. The word no longer stung. It started to change shape. It became a seed, small but sharp, and I planted it deep, not in hate, but in memory. Because what she didn't know, what she could never imagine, was that I already held something she wanted. Something bigger than furniture or status or appearances. Something that couldn't be taken by insult or arrogance. As I looked at the dim lights glowing from her car pulling back into the driveway that night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. People like her think time is on their side. They think youth gives them power and that the old are simply waiting for permission to fade. But I wasn't fading. I was preparing. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every smirk she threw my way, I collected them all quietly, the way a hunter gathers clues before setting a trap. When I went to bed, I smiled to myself for the first time in a long time because I realized something she never would. That age isn't weakness. Age is experience wrapped in stillness. And stillness makes people underestimate you. That's what makes it powerful. The next morning, she greeted me with that same smug confidence, talking about her business and how independent women like her built things on their own. I let her talk. I let her feel strong. Because power means nothing when you don't know who really holds the pen behind your story. And mine was already written. From the day she married my son, she had her eyes not on love, but on ownership. She smiled in photos, kissed cheeks at holidays, called me mom in front of neighbors, but underneath every word was calculation. She wasn't building a family, she was building a position. Within weeks of moving in, she began asking questions about the house, who it was registered under, how the taxes were paid, whether the will had been updated. My son brushed it off as curiosity, but I saw it clearly. Greed wears perfume and polite smiles, but it always smells the same. She wanted control. Not over him, over everything that came before her. She started with little things. She took over grocery payments, claiming she wanted to help manage expenses. She began answering the phone when the bank called. She spoke over me during conversations about repairs, saying things like, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it." She even corrected me when guests asked about the home, smiling as she said, "It's our place now." My son never noticed how those words shifted, from mine to ours, from ours to hers, from hers to not even mentioning me at all. Her obsession with control extended beyond the house. She talked endlessly about her beauty salon, the one she'd opened a year before marrying my son. She called it her empire. She bragged about her success and her independence. She liked to tell people how she built everything from nothing. But I knew the truth. That business hadn't started with her ambition. It had started with my savings. The same savings I'd set aside for emergencies, withdrawn at my son's request because his wife just needed a little help to start something. I gave it freely, thinking it would make her feel capable, thinking it would help them build a future together. I had no idea I was funding a weapon she would later use to humiliate me. I remember the day she came home holding a bouquet of flowers, smiling like a queen, saying her salon had finally broken even. My son hugged her proudly, and they toasted with champagne I paid for. She thanked everyone but me. She didn't even look in my direction. I didn't need her gratitude, but I noticed the pattern of memory. The more she gained, the smaller she tried to make me. Every success she had, she built a wall with it, one that shut me further out of the life I had created. Still, I watched in silence. Because silence isn't surrender, it's study. I listened when she talked about hiring new staff. I paid attention when she mentioned her expansion plans. I watched her pride grow faster than her awareness. She thought she owned her business outright. She thought my old-fashioned handwriting on the first loan documents was just decorative. She never asked why my name was there. She never thought to check the files at all. When I visited her salon for the first time, I smiled as she showed me around. The walls were painted gold, her name in big letters on the window. She spoke like a ruler giving a tour of her kingdom. Clients came and went, all calling her boss. I sat in the corner, sipping tea, pretending to admire the place while quietly noting every detail. The licenses framed on the wall, the registration number at the bottom of her receipts, the trust seal next to it. Every one of them tied back to my lawyer's office. She thought power came from having keys and a title, but real power comes from understanding paper. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to remind her who had made that empire possible. The documents already spoke for me, buried neatly in legal files she'd never cared to read. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that while she strutted around, calling me outdated and useless, every dollar she earned was already passing through my trust account. That night, I went home and took out the old folder where I kept the first agreement. My signature sat next to hers, right above the title, Silent Partner. I ran my fingers over the ink, thinking about how the same hand she mocked for trembling with age was the one that held the foundation of her success. That thought made me smile. Not out of revenge, but out of patience. Because time, I knew, would do the rest. She wanted control so badly that she forgot control doesn't mean ownership. It means understanding who really holds the strings. And in her story, every thread still led back to me. The change started slow, like most betrayals do. She began redecorating the house, saying it looked too old, that it needed younger energy. My son agreed, barely listening, as if the walls that had raised him no longer mattered. She started moving furniture, taking down the curtains I'd sewn by hand, replacing the dishes my husband and I had bought the year we married. Each item disappeared quietly. My tablecloth, my framed photos, the rocking chair that had once soothed my baby boy through long nights. When I asked where something had gone, she'd shrug and say, "Oh, I donated it. It didn't fit anymore." I wanted to tell her those things fit perfectly. They just didn't fit her. Then one afternoon, I came home to find the living room empty. The chair, his chair, the one my late husband used to sit in every evening, polishing his tools, reading his paper, humming old songs that still lingered in the air long after he passed. Gone. Not moved. Gone. She'd thrown it out, saying it made the room feel cluttered. My son didn't stop her. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, quiet, pretending it wasn't happening. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger, something new, something quieter, colder, more deliberate. I walked to my room that night and looked around. Half the shelves were empty. My life was being erased one small thing at a time, and they were too proud to notice what that meant. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall where my husband's photo used to hang, and I realized that silence no longer meant peace. It meant consent. And I was done giving it. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping quiet was the same as keeping dignity, that letting things go was a sign of grace. But there comes a point when grace becomes surrender, and surrender becomes invisibility. I was tired of being invisible in the house I had built, surrounded by people who thought respect was optional once you turned old. That night, I opened my dresser drawer and took out the small key to my lockbox, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were my most important papers: the deed, the partnership contracts, the trust records. All signed, all legal, all binding. I ran my hand across the signatures, tracing the past like a map to the future. The next morning, she called me dramatic for being attached to junk. She laughed as she told her friends she was modernizing the family home. I listened from the kitchen as they giggled, sipping coffee that I had paid for, under a roof that I had bought. The irony didn't sting anymore. It settled, like dust after a storm. They thought they were cleaning the house, but they were really just sweeping themselves closer to a truth I had been saving for years. That evening, she came into my room again, phone in hand, talking about expansion. She wanted to open another branch of her salon, this time in her name only. She spoke like a queen, pacing across my carpet, explaining how experience is important, but youth runs the world. I sat there quietly, nodding, letting her arrogance fill the air. I memorized every word, every gesture, every flash of pride in her eyes. She thought she had won, that she'd pushed me out of my own space, reduced me to a memory that would soon fade away. But the thing about pushing people who built the ground beneath you is that you never know how deep their roots go. Mine went farther than she could ever imagine. That night, when she went to bed, I made a decision that felt less like revenge and more like restoration. I wasn't going to raise my voice or demand my respect back. I was going to let the paper do the talking. The next morning, while they left for work, I called my lawyer. His voice was calm, steady, the way it always was. I told him it was time to check on the documents for the business. He paused, then said he'd be ready whenever I was. I told him to prepare for an audit, a full one. No warning, no delay. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. As I hung up, I stood by the window, the morning light cutting across the floor where my husband's chair once stood. The house looked empty, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless inside it. They had taken things I could touch, furniture, memories, space. But what they didn't know was that I still held what they couldn't see, the ownership, the proof, the law. She thought she'd replaced the old with the new. What she really did was awaken the part of me that remembered who built it all in the first place. Years before she married my son, when her voice was still polite and her eyes still soft with respect, she had come to me for help. She wanted to open her own salon, she said. Something for women, by women. Her dream, her independence. She made it sound noble, and I wanted to believe her. I had always supported ambition. I knew what it was like to start from nothing, so I agreed to help her. I went to my bank, withdrew what I had saved for my old age and gave it to her. Not as a gift, but as a lesson. A lesson that hard work deserves foundation. My lawyer was careful, precise. He drafted a small contract, nothing dramatic, just paperwork to protect what I was giving. He called it a silent partnership. I smiled at the phrase. It suited me. Silent but present. She signed every page without reading. Her fingers were trembling from excitement, not caution. Her eyes were full of dreams, not understanding. I didn't blame her. Youth always mistakes generosity for weakness. When the salon opened, she hung her name in bright gold letters above the door. She called it her empire. People clapped. My son took photos and they toasted with champagne. Not once did she mention who had made the first payment. I stood in the corner, watching her pose for the cameras, her hands covered in glitter and pride. She thought she'd built it all by herself. I didn't correct her. Some truths are better left to time, because time, more than anything, reveals character. Months passed, then years. The salon grew. She hired more workers, started posting online, called herself a businesswoman. She spent weekends bragging about her success, while I quietly received statements from the bank showing quarterly profits deposited into my trust. She never looked at those details. She was too busy being adored. Every month, her accountant sent financial summaries that listed my name in fine print. Co-owner, 50%. She never noticed. She never asked. She thought those words were routine. The arrogance of comfort blinded her to the truth that the empire she ruled had been funded, protected, and half owned by the woman she called pathetic. I remember the first time I visited after it started doing well. She gave me a tour, her voice echoing with pride. "This," she said, waving her arms, "is the result of hard work." She didn't notice how my eyes lingered on the framed license at the front counter, the business registration number printed neatly under two names, hers and mine. I smiled politely. She had no idea that every client she served, every product she sold, every employee she paid was legally operating under a business I co-owned. Every profit she boasted about passed through my account before reaching hers. Over the years, she began expanding. New chairs, new signs, new mirrors. My son invested his time, not his money. She began to believe she was unstoppable. The arrogance in her tone grew. She'd mock my old ways, tell me I was stuck in time. She once joked to her friends that I didn't understand modern business. I almost laughed out loud, thinking about how my lawyer still handled every legal update that kept her business compliant. Her entire success was standing on paper she'd never read, written by hands she had long since dismissed. Then came the day she started talking about franchising. She wanted to open more branches, spread her brand across the state. My son was thrilled. They held meetings at the house using my dining table like it was theirs. She bragged about the profits, how she'd soon be recognized as a leader in the industry. Each time she spoke, I heard less about gratitude and more about power. That's when I knew she had forgotten completely who made her rise possible. I kept every document neatly stored in my drawer, the partnership contract, the annual filings, the legal renewals. I knew one day she'd push too far. One day her pride would demand proof of ownership, and that's when she'd meet her reflection in ink. I didn't have to rush her downfall. I just had to let her arrogance ripen. And it did. When she mocked me in my own house, called me pathetic, and laughed while wearing jewels my money had bought, I realized the paper trail didn't just protect me. It exposed her. All I had to do was wait. The same papers she ignored were waiting quietly in my lawyer's safe, dated, stamped, and airtight. Her business might have had her name on the sign, but the law didn't care about signs. The law cared about signatures, and one of those signatures, the one next to hers, belonged to me. Revenge didn't need words. It only needed her to ask the wrong question in the right room. After that night, I started smiling more. Not the kind of smile that hides sadness. The kind that hides preparation. She thought she had broken me, that her arrogance had finally silenced the old woman she mocked. But the truth was, her noise only made my calm sharper. I moved through the house quietly, pretending to agree with every decision she made. When she replaced my husband's chair with a glossy new couch, I complimented it. When she redecorated the dining room, I nodded. When she called me outdated, I smiled. Because patience looks like weakness to the proud, and that's what makes it powerful. Every morning I would walk past her salon on my way to the market. Through the window, I could see her standing at the counter, laughing loudly with her customers, flashing her diamond ring as she handed out receipts. Her confidence filled the room like perfume, strong, overwhelming, temporary. She was so proud of what she thought she had built, so sure that she was the queen of her little world. I walked in sometimes just to sit in the corner to watch. She would greet me politely in front of her clients, but her tone was sharp, condescending. She loved showing people how far she'd come, how successful she was. Every time she said it, I smiled a little more, because I knew something she didn't, that her so-called empire still had my name printed quietly beneath it, like a shadow following her crown. I watched as she hired new staff, renovated the place, bought new equipment, all with money drawn from the business account that still required my signature for every major withdrawal. She never noticed. She just assumed her manager handled it. Her arrogance blinded her to every document that passed through her own hands. I let her grow comfortable, because comfort is where people slip. I didn't have to fight her. I just had to let her forget who helped her rise. My lawyer called me every few months, updating me on the numbers. I always told him the same thing. Keep everything quiet. He knew me well enough not to ask why. He handled the annual filings, the taxes, the audits. Each document went through my name before hers. She signed them too, never reading past the first line. Every time she renewed the license, she unknowingly confirmed my ownership all over again. Paper doesn't lie. Pride just doesn't read. When she talked about expanding her business, she bragged that she had investors waiting, that her brand was strong enough to stand on its own. I let her keep talking. I even encouraged her, asking small questions, pretending to be curious. She saw it as validation. The old woman finally impressed. What she didn't know was that every word she said only reminded me how blind she had become. She wasn't just proud, she was careless. By the time the audit came around that year, I had already made my plan. I told my lawyer to schedule the meeting at the house where both she and my son would be present. It was a standard procedure, I said. Nothing unusual, just routine. I even mentioned it at dinner, casually. She smiled, eager to show off her success, thinking the lawyer's visit was about expanding her franchise. She didn't realize it was the beginning of the end. That week, I kept my calm. I watched her prance around the salon, preparing presentation folders, polishing her speech about how well her business was doing. She practiced lines about hard work and self-made success as if she were preparing for an award. My son helped her, proud of her confidence, blind to the arrogance it carried. They had no idea the papers they'd soon hear read aloud would change everything. The morning of the meeting, she wore her best suit. My son recorded short clips for social media, calling it a family business milestone. They thought the lawyer was coming to celebrate her progress. I set the table, brewed tea, and sat quietly, my heart steady. Not out of excitement, not out of revenge, just completion. Years of silence were about to speak all at once, and I didn't have to raise my voice to make it happen. When the lawyer arrived, I greeted him politely. He gave me a small nod, the kind that says everything without a word. She smiled, shook his hand, and handed him her folder of business goals. He didn't even open it. He already had his own. And as the papers came out, I sat still, hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the same small smile she'd once called pathetic, because the storm had already started, and I was the calm inside it. The lawyer arrived precisely at noon. He was a quiet man, always had been, the kind who didn't waste words because the paper did all the talking. He placed his briefcase on the table and opened it carefully, laying out a stack of files. She was already seated, smiling for the camera my son had set up. They were planning to film a small clip about family success, how teamwork built their future. She had even arranged flowers on the table, ready for what she thought was a celebration. I sat opposite her, my hands still, my expression calm. She looked radiant, proud, untouchable, but pride and ignorance often look the same just before they break. The lawyer began to speak. He explained it was the annual review, a standard business audit, ensuring that ownership records and profit statements were up to date. She nodded confidently, waving her hand like it was routine. She thought she was in charge. She didn't realize she wasn't. Even the one being addressed. My son leaned back in his chair, smiling, recording bits of the conversation. He thought it would make great content for his social media, a proud husband showing off his wife's achievement. The lawyer flipped the first page, adjusted his glasses, and started reading aloud. The numbers came first. Revenue up 15%, expenses steady, growth projections strong. She beamed at every sentence. She looked at me like she was waiting for me to finally admit how wrong I'd been about her. I let her have that moment because I knew it would be her last. When the lawyer reached the section titled Ownership and Control, his tone didn't change, but the air in the room did. I could feel it. A faint shift. That pause between certainty and collapse. Primary owner of record, he said, reading directly from the document, 51%. And then he said my name. The words echoed across the table like a gunshot muffled by velvet. She blinked, confused, then laughed, that nervous kind of laugh people use when they think they've misheard something. She looked at my son, who frowned, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. The lawyer continued calmly, reading through the clauses that defined the silent partnership. Secondary owner of record, he read next, 49%. And then her name. The smile fell from her face in pieces. My son stopped recording. The camera light blinked once, then dimmed as silence filled the room. The lawyer explained that the business had always been a dual ownership entity, filed under my trust for legal protection. Every profit, every license renewal, every tax form, all had been processed under that structure. These have been in effect since the business was registered, he said, sliding the file across the table. Her signature, bold and careless, sat right beside mine. She stared at it like it was written in another language. I watched her fingers tremble as she flipped the pages one by one, searching for an escape clause that didn't exist. My son leaned forward, his confusion turning into disbelief. He asked questions the lawyer didn't need to answer. Everything was in black and white. There were no surprises, only neglected truths. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just let the silence sit, heavy and undeniable. Her posture changed. The arrogance melted first, then the confidence, until what was left was just fear. She looked at me, and for the first time there was no insult in her eyes, only the reflection of someone realizing too late what respect really means. My son's face turned pale. The lawyer continued reading, his voice steady, professional. He mentioned that all major decisions, including financial transactions and expansion plans, required the primary owner's consent. Mine. Every branch she wanted to open, every investor she wanted to partner with, every loan she had planned, all of it was now in my hands. The lawyer closed the file, neatly stacked the papers, and looked at me for confirmation. I nodded once. He took that as his cue to end the session. He packed his briefcase, bowed slightly, and left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. For a long time, no one spoke. My son's phone was still on the table, the camera still rolling quietly, capturing a different kind of family moment. Not celebration, but realization. She finally whispered something under her breath, too soft to hear, but the tremor in her hands said enough. The power she thought she owned had just been reclaimed without a single raised voice. I stood up slowly, steady on my cane, and walked out of the room. No dramatics, no revenge speech, no satisfaction. Just quiet justice doing what it does best, showing itself at the exact moment it can't be ignored. That day, the old woman she mocked disappeared. In her place stood the owner she never saw coming. The silence that followed the lawyer's words was heavy, almost physical. You could feel it sitting on the air like dust. The only sound left in the room was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the slow creak of her chair as she leaned forward, eyes locked on the papers in disbelief. Her lipstick smile, the one she wore like armor, started to fade at the edges. She blinked, once, twice, then reached out for the file, her hand trembling so slightly it made the paper rustle. The lawyer slid it closer without a word. My son looked frozen beside her, the kind of stillness that happens when reality finally catches up to arrogance. She read the first page, her lips moving silently, tracing words she had never bothered to understand. Primary owner of record, it said. My name. Her hand stopped mid-motion. The color drained from her face, leaving only the shine of shock on her skin. She turned the next page, faster now, like speed could rewrite what was already written, but every line was the same. Clear, dated, notarized, legal. Her signature sat beside mine on each page, her neat handwriting next to the proof of her own blindness. The lawyer didn't interrupt. He simply sat there, professional and quiet, letting her realize on her own what she'd ignored for years. Her breathing changed. The kind of sharp inhale that sounds like someone choking on pride. She looked at my son, expecting him to say something, to fix it, to deny it, but he couldn't. He just sat there, staring at the documents, the same ones he'd dismissed as boring legal stuff when I'd asked him years ago to read them. He rubbed his temples, muttered something to himself, but the words didn't come out. He was watching everything he believed he owned slip into the hands of the woman he'd stopped respecting. The lawyer cleared his throat once, softly, and began to explain what this meant. That I was the majority shareholder, the primary decision-maker, the legal authority, behind every financial and managerial aspect of the business. She interrupted him, her voice cracking, saying it must be a mistake, that she'd been running everything. The lawyer, still calm, pointed to the date of registration. He said gently that the contract was binding, renewed yearly, and that she had signed every one of those renewals herself. There was no mistake. There was just ignorance. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opening slightly as if to argue, but no sound came out. Only that trembling hand still gripping the papers like they might change if she held them tighter. Then came the part that broke her completely. The lawyer mentioned that any future business transactions, partnerships, or changes to the brand required my written consent. She wouldn't be able to move a single dollar without my approval. Her head dropped slowly, and I watched as realization replaced confidence. She wasn't in control anymore. She never had been. She just hadn't known who truly was. My son's phone, still recording on the table, caught everything. The sound of the paper sliding, the chair scraping back, the faint gasp that escaped her when she understood. He reached to stop the recording, his hand shaking too, but not as much as hers. She looked at me across the table then, finally seeing me. Not the old woman she mocked, not the burden she wanted gone, but the silent owner. the one whose patience had outlasted her pride. For a long while, no one moved. The air was thick with everything they'd said to me, the insults, the laughter, the arrogance, all of it coming back around, heavier than ever. I stayed seated, calm, the same way I had been the day she called me pathetic. The lawyer stood, packed his files, and nodded to me before leaving. The sound of the door closing was final, like the last word in a sentence I had been writing for years. She sat still for another minute before pushing the papers away. Her hands were trembling so much now that the edge of the table rattled. My son stood up and walked toward the window, silent, pale, small. I stood last. No anger, no gloating, no words of triumph. Just quiet understanding, and the kind that only comes when truth has finished doing its work. She had mocked my wrinkles, my hands, my years, but at that table, with the lawyer's voice still echoing in her head, it was her hands that shook, not mine, and in that trembling, I saw everything I had waited for. Not revenge, not punishment, just balance. After the meeting, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was hollow. The kind of silence that follows after everything has broken, when words no longer have power because the truth has already spoken. My son and his wife didn't talk for hours. She stayed in the living room, hunched over the documents, flipping through them again and again as if somewhere inside there had to be a page that changed the story. There wasn't. My son stood by the window, looking out but not really seeing anything. I made myself tea, my movements slow, deliberate. The clinking of the cup against the saucer was the only sound that dared to exist between us. By the next morning, the weight of what happened started spreading like cracks in glass. Her accountant called first, confused about new authorization requirements on the business accounts. Then came the emails from vendors asking who the new signature authority was. She tried to handle it herself, replying hastily, insisting that there must have been a mistake, but each reply she sent bounced back to her with the same note: "Please verify with the primary owner." She called the bank, her voice tight, trembling, switching between politeness and panic. They confirmed it. The accounts were under joint control, with me as majority. She hung up mid-sentence. My son tried to console her, but his voice sounded empty. The confidence he used to carry had turned to confusion. He asked her what she'd signed, why she hadn't checked, and for the first time she didn't have an answer. The arrogance that once filled her had evaporated. She sat there, still in her robe, surrounded by papers and receipts, her hair undone, her pride unraveling with it. She looked smaller, suddenly older. That's what truth does. It ages arrogance overnight. Within days, her empire began to crumble. Suppliers hesitated to ship without my approval. Employees whispered, uncertain of who was really in charge. Clients started canceling appointments after seeing the chaos online. I didn't lift a finger. I didn't need to. She had built her world on a foundation of assumption, and assumption collapses faster than stone. Her phone kept ringing. Lawyers, partners, friends, all wanting explanations she couldn't give. Every decision she tried to make required my signature. Every attempt to move money or sign a contract was blocked by the one name she couldn't escape: mine. Then the news spread. Quiet at first, then louder. The story of her downfall made its way through her social circles. The woman who mocked others for being outdated had failed to read her own paperwork. The one who bragged about independence had been running someone else's business all along. The humiliation was public, but I didn't watch it. I didn't need to. Humiliation isn't revenge. It's consequence. And consequences don't need an audience. My son, caught between guilt and loyalty, began to crumble too. His wife blamed him, saying it was his fault for introducing the lawyer to me, for not protecting her, for not reading the documents himself. He tried to defend himself, but the truth didn't care whose fault it was. It was shared between them. They had both chosen ignorance over humility, and now ignorance had chosen to repay them with ruin. One evening, I heard them arguing outside. The words didn't matter. The tone did. Anger, desperation, shame. She accused him of siding with me. He accused her of destroying everything. Their marriage, like her business, was built on pride, and pride doesn't survive exposure. When the shouting stopped, the door slammed. He drove away. She didn't follow. The next morning, she was gone too. For a week, the house was empty. I cleaned in silence, one room at a time. I found the papers they had left scattered on the table, some torn, some crumpled, all useless now. I gathered them, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a folder. I wasn't angry. I wasn't satisfied either. I just felt still. The truth had done what it needed to do. A month later, the lawyer called to confirm that she had formally resigned as secondary owner. He congratulated me, but I didn't see it as victory. I saw it as closure. I told him to transfer full operational control to someone new, someone who would treat people with respect. A young woman who had once worked under her, quiet, humble, and kind. I met her once and saw something familiar, hunger, but not greed. She reminded me of myself before age and disappointment taught me the difference. When the papers were signed and filed, I visited the salon one last time. The sign still bore the same name, but it looked different now. The lights were softer, the walls freshly painted. I smiled as I stood by the window watching customers come and go. Not one of them knew the story behind that building, and that was fine. The story wasn't for them. It was for the woman who once thought respect was optional and learned too late that it was the only thing worth owning. I turned and walked away, my cane tapping steadily on the sidewalk. The empire she stole had come full circle, not out of revenge, but out of justice. Quiet, clean, complete. The weeks that followed were the quietest my house had been in years. No footsteps rushing down the hall. No arguments over breakfast. No perfume hanging in the air long after she'd left for her salon. Just stillness. A kind of peace that didn't come from joy, but from release. I'd lived too long surrounded by noise that called itself love. Now, with the silence, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. My days returned to the rhythm they once had. Slow mornings, gentle walks, the kettle whistling. Just loud enough to fill the emptiness that people had once occupied. Word spread slowly. The neighbors whispered, curious but careful. Some asked if everything was true, if she had really lost everything, if my son had really left. I didn't answer. People will fill silence with their own versions of the truth. They always do. I didn't owe anyone the full story. The law had already written it for me. My name was back where it belonged. Not on a wall, not on a plaque, but in the place where it mattered most. On the papers that proved who truly built what. The salon reopened under new management a month later. The young woman I had chosen, quiet, respectful, hardworking, ran it with steady hands. She didn't boast, didn't posture, didn't pretend. She worked long hours, smiled at customers, paid her staff on time. When I visited the first week it reopened, she came out from behind the counter and hugged me. No words, just gratitude. That was enough. I looked around and saw the space transformed. Not richer, not fancier, just honest. The same sign hung above the door, the same name in gold, but now it stood for something entirely different. It no longer carried arrogance. It carried redemption. My son returned once after that, weeks later. He looked smaller somehow. Not in body, but in spirit. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had fallen apart. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, careful, stripped of the pride that once filled it. He said he hadn't known what was happening, that he never meant for things to go that far. I didn't interrupt him. I just listened. He said he thought love meant never questioning those you care about. I told him love also means seeing people for who they truly are, even when it's uncomfortable. He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes down, like a man realizing that forgiveness and respect aren't the same thing. He asked about her once, where she'd gone, how she was. I didn't know. She had disappeared from the town quietly, taking her pride with her. Rumor said she tried to open another salon under a different name, but it didn't last. People remembered too much. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild the same way. I didn't hate her for it. Hatred keeps wounds open. I had already healed. At home, I started restoring the things she'd thrown away. The old chair was gone for good, but I replaced it with another. Not identical, but close enough. I hung my husband's photograph back on the wall where it belonged. I brought out the old dishes from the cupboard and cooked for myself the way I used to, before my life became an audience for someone else's ambition. Everything was smaller now. Simpler, quieter, and better. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about that day at the table, the lawyer reading her own signature aloud, her hands shaking, her face crumbling under the weight of realization. I didn't feel pleasure remembering it, just clarity. Because in that moment, she finally saw what I had known all along, that age isn't weakness, it's experience written in patience. And patience has a way of waiting exactly as long as it needs to. I found an envelope in the mail one morning. No return address, no note. Inside was a single folded page, A resignation form, signed by her, officially removing herself from the company registry. No apology, no explanation. Just her signature. The same handwriting that had once called me pathetic. I sat down, unfolded it again, and smiled. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to fight. The world had already done the fighting for me. I filed the paper away with the others, closed the cabinet, and brewed myself another cup of tea. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. I looked out the window at the soft morning light falling across the garden my husband and I had planted decades ago. Everything we built was still there, strong, alive, growing. Time had stripped away what didn't belong, leaving only what was meant to last. She had mocked my age once, thinking it made me fragile. But age isn't fragile. It's iron wrapped in calm, and when iron finally speaks, even arrogance bends to listen. The world moves fast for the young, but it always slows down for the truth. Time has a way of returning everything to its rightful owner, not just property or money, but dignity too. I learned that revenge doesn't need shouting or chaos or even hate, it just needs patience, the kind that sits quietly and lets others build their own fall. My daughter-in-law thought age was a burden. She thought the lines on my face were signs of weakness, not maps of wisdom. She saw my silence as surrender, when in truth it was the sound of planning. I let her believe she had won, let her laugh, let her mock, let her paint herself as the future. But when the papers were read and her hands began to shake, that was not the sound of victory leaving her. It was the sound of respect returning to me. I often think about that moment, not because I wanted to see her ruined, but because it reminded me how fragile pride really is. All it takes is one page of truth to break years of arrogance. I didn't destroy her. I just turned the mirror she refused to face. And in that reflection, she saw herself for the first time. Not as a queen, not as a victim, but as a woman who had tried to take what she never earned. The law didn't punish her. Life did. It always does. I didn't have to lift my voice, because the same hands that signed her rise also signed her fall. My son comes by sometimes now. He doesn't talk about the past anymore. We sit in the garden, the same one I planted with his father years ago, the same soil that's seen every season of our family. Love, loss, betrayal, forgiveness. He helps me water the plants. And we talk about small things, like the weather or the neighbors or the stray cat that keeps visiting. I see the guilt still in his eyes, but I never mention it. Guilt is its own teacher. Some lessons don't need words. I know he's learned what matters. That respect once lost costs more to regain than any house or company or title. I keep the papers locked away in a drawer. Not out of pride, but out of peace. Proof, not of revenge, but of justice done quietly. Every so often I open that drawer and read the first line. Primary owner of record. My name follows, steady and clear. It reminds me that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers from the edges of patience, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to prove anything. It just exists. Calm and absolute. People still talk, of course. They always do. Some call me cruel, others call me clever. I don't correct either. Let them think what they want. I didn't do it to be either of those things. I did it because some lines can't go unanswered. When someone mocks your age, your silence, your worth, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is remind them that time is watching. And time has a longer memory than pride ever will. Now, in the evenings, I sit on the porch with my tea, the same cup I used the day the lawyer came. The air is still, the light soft. I can hear the faint hum of the world beyond my gate, rushing, spinning, forgetting. But in my home, everything is steady. I've learned that peace isn't something you're given. It's something you earn when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who never cared to understand. She called me pathetic once. I think of that word sometimes, not with anger, but with quiet amusement, because there's nothing pathetic about a woman who survives disrespect and still stands tall enough to be mistaken for fragile. Pathetic isn't growing old. It's wasting youth on cruelty. And that's something she'll understand someday when time slows down for her too. Age didn't make me weak. It made me patient, sharp, deliberate. It taught me that silence can be louder than shouting, and that revenge, when done right, doesn't destroy. It corrects. She took years trying to make me feel small, but it took me only one signature to remind her who I've always been. Not a victim, not a fool. Just a mother who refused to be forgotten. So I sit here now, calm, steady, and free. My hands don't shake, my heart doesn't race, and my house, my peace is mine again. Some wars end with noise. Mine ended with a pen, a paper, and a silence that still speaks louder than anything she ever said.